Recently, I saw, as many of you do from time to time, one of the little TED Talks that comes across on the internet. And this was a talk given by a man who, at the age of 19, when he was traveling in Israel, had been in an accident, and as a result, his life was completely changed, and he'd struggled physically and was partially paralyzed. And this is now some 15 or so years later. And the reason he was in the accident is that there'd been a man driving a truck that was heavily loaded, and the man was a little bit reckless and clipped the edge of the bus where this man was sitting in the back corner. One person died in the accident. He was severely injured. The bus driver himself was not. Many years later, this man, who's now become a journalist, the injured man who's now become a journalist, goes on one of these quests, and he's going to find the bus driver. So the talk, which was pretty interesting, and it was also extremely interesting how this man had conquered his disabilities, he eventually tracks down this man who was not an educated person or a very privileged person. He was a truck driver, and especially in the context where he was living, that was just not a high-level profession. So he finally finds the man, and he's not really sure what he wants, but he's sort of looking for the experience. And what he discovers is that whereas, of course, the injured man has contemplated this experience from every possible angle and knows all the details of the whole thing, the truck driver has thought about it very little, is very unclear even how many people died, how many people were hurt. He has new facts about why the accident happened in the first place. He has a completely different perception of who was injured. He sees himself as the primary victim of the whole experience. And the journalist, the injured man, at the end of it all, he has nothing of what he hoped to have, except the realization that there is a huge difference between an examined life and an unexamined life. And the journalist admits that the accident has pushed him into having a far more examined life than he may have had if his plan had gone on unchecked. But this truck driver is just living something else now. And there's no amount of reason or argument or coercion or anything that the journalist could do to change the truck driver's perception. He was operating on the level of the reality that he perceived, and this is what he perceived. What they say in the astral world, where the physical world that we live in is a mixture of many vibrations. It's very easy for us to see it. Just the story I told tells you that how many different levels of awareness exist simultaneously and how lives collide with each other, but the vibrations don't match, just the karma brings you together. In the world as we live in now, because we're transitioning from a lower to a higher yuga, there is a vast array of consciousness simultaneously, even physically right next to each other. An ever-accelerating, increasing spiritual seriousness balanced or counterweighted by this ever-increasing selfish disregard of a relationship to a greater reality, and the two forces are polarizing and creating ever-increasing tension in the world we live in. In the astral world, where everything is vibration, we go to the astral world that matches our vibration. And if we're highly evolved spiritually, if we have a great love of beauty, if we have a passion for music, if we're dedicated to science, we go into an atmosphere that is completely compatible with our own. And that's why the astral world, we remember it on some level or long for it in some way as this time of enormous relaxation, of freedom, of happiness. If we're elevated, there are also hells. Swamiji picked up a book at East West Bookshop, which was about past life experiences which were not, near-death experiences which were not happy. And Swamiji said, I knew there had to be some of these because not everybody who dies is a good person. there were some very interesting stories about people who died and came back, who realized the tremendous error of their ways because of what they'd seen on the other side, because their trajectory of consciousness took them to its natural extension, and it was not anything they wanted, and came back and changed their lives. One very interesting example, since I've digressed this far, was a very powerful academic man, scientific academic, and he was a university professor, and he became quite atheistic and cynical in his attitude, and he took great pleasure in destroying any little bit of faith that his students brought into the classroom. And he became quite, he had a big career, he was very well known, he was highly respected, and it was all based on this cynical capacity to demolish with his powerful intellect any spiritual attitudes that people had. So when he died, he went into a place where there was no hope. And he experienced what it was like to have all hope taken away. That this is it, and there's nothing else. And it was just a vibration of consciousness, and there was a whole universe of people just like him. And he also saw, what, because in that world, if I remember it correctly, for the time that he was there, and when you're out of your body and in these realms, time is not the same. So even if he was clinically dead for just a short period of time, there was no sense of long or short. But he also, in that world, tried to find some values, and there were people always who were smashing him down. So he got to experience exactly who he had been and what the consequences of that were. And when he came back into his life, he was absolutely horrified because he'd never been aware enough to really see what he was doing. Now, just the irony of the whole thing was, he'd built a huge career on being that kind of person. And his family and his relatives, everybody was all with him in the benefits of this great life. And when he repudiated it, he lost the respect of his colleagues. He ended up losing his marriage, his career, his home, everything. But he gained his soul back, basically. So now, if I can find the thread here. When we're in the astral world, as it's described, and to me this is more intuition than experience, but a higher astral vibration can see a lower vibration, and the higher beings serve by trying to uplift those who are aspiring. But a lower vibration, to a certain extent, can see a higher vibration, but they can't go into it until they themselves match that vibration. And in very low vibrations, they can't see the high vibrations at all. That's what keeps them trapped there. A woman who took her own life, tried to, but didn't remain in the astral world but came back, went into a world where a lot of people had committed suicide. And she said the characteristic of that world is that everybody was looking down. And whether they were actually physically had their eyes down, but their consciousness was down. And because she wasn't destined to stay there, and was so horrified suddenly by what had happened, because people had repudiated all hope. And so they just sat in this hopeless state. She became aware that there were angelic beings right above them, trying to get their attention. And then she saw those angelic beings and was pulled out. And then she came back to this world and took up the campaign of trying to give people hope. It's interesting because I'm using that word right now. When I was in Assisi a month ago, on my way to the pilgrimage to Israel, they asked me to give a few satsangs because I haven't been there in a long time, and so I did. And because I don't really know that community very well, I asked people to submit questions, written questions, since we didn't always speak the same language. They could be translated. And so that I could have a feeling of where people were at and what they wanted to know. And I had a few interesting questions, simple questions. Someone asked what my name means, Asha. My name means hope. And then another question later on was, after all your years on the spiritual path of knowing Swamiji, in one word, what is the biggest lesson you've learned? And I thought, well, now that's an interesting question. And I sat with that question for a few moments. And then I realized it was my name. The one thing that the spiritual path has taught me above all things is hope. Now, that sounds simple. I've always really liked my name. I've liked both the meaning of it, the simplicity, the fact there's only 4 letters in it and 2 of them are the same. I mean, those little things like that are very handy. When we would ask Swami Kriyananda for spiritual names years ago, you would always be a little nervous about what he would name you. The word tapasya means austerity. You know, in your greatest fear, he would give you a name that had the word tapasya in it. That really isn't what you wanted. And I don't know whether this was anybody's real name, but we used to say that, or perhaps he's going to call you Rupamana Haridasi, which would be kind of a mouthful. Sometimes people got their spiritual name sort of accidentally. Arati, a woman who's called Arati now, there's 2 Aratis, but the woman who's my peer, she was really working in the garden. They started calling her Rudabhagadasi, which means the servant of the Rudabhagas. And when Swami heard that, he said that really will not do. So he gave her another name. But the fact that my one-word lesson happens to be my name, maybe it was divinely intended. Maybe it's just a fact. But I started explaining in that satsang, and I'm thinking about it now because we're talking about reincarnation, what the power of that single word is. If you really think about it, I was talking about what drives people to suicide as an example. What drives people to suicide is they don't feel that there's any hope. It happens terribly to adolescents because their perspective on life is so narrow. They don't understand how time passes. I've so enjoyed being into my 70s, barely, but I'm into my 70s now, and how glorious it is to have had enough years pass that you really cannot forget that time passes. Sometimes when I'm trying to encourage someone who's in a difficult situation, I say, really, don't worry, something will happen. And then they'll think that I've said something good will happen. No. I haven't actually said that. But something always happens. It never just, whatever you're suffering now, don't worry, something will happen. This is not going to be forever. Now, of course, gradually you realize, good, bad, indifferent, something always happens, and the time passes, and then there you get to deal with something else. It's either better or worse, but nonetheless, it's not static. It's never static. But what keeps us going in a very positive way is this idea that there is always hope. Hope for whatever it is that I may long for. And people long for whatever they can imagine that will make them happy. I remember, I think it was a book by Ayn Rand that I read a zillion years ago. I can sort of see the book and see myself reading it, so I must have been in my 20s. Maybe it was even before I came to Ananda, I don't even recall. But I recall part of that story, whatever that story was, some poor, woman is trying to escape out of Russia, because those were the pictures of her books. They're very bleak books. And so this poor woman is trying to crawl across some snow-covered border, and she's, in the book, she's some great elevated character, and then there's some guard who's there to keep people from crawling across the border, and he shoots her. And she dies. Cheerful story. Whoa, okay. But what I remember, and it's always stayed in my mind, and it was very skillfully done in literary terms, the woman who was trying to escape was a very refined, fictional, but refined, uplifted, intelligent. That's why she was trying to get free. The guard who shot her was thinking about dinner. And prior to that, he was thinking about breakfast, and then he was thinking about his vodka in between, and then he saw something moving, so he killed it. It's like this is how the clash of our worlds come. That everybody is just doing whatever they think is going to fulfill them. This man's duty was to protect the border, and he was not a very elevated person, so he thought just in terms of what he could eat and what he could sleep, and just like that's all that he's thinking about. This woman is refined, she's thinking poetry, she's thinking music, she's thinking beauty, she's thinking service, and these forces clash. And this is what we're always dealing with. We're always trying to move forward, and we're always meeting some obstacle. And at first, at different times, we get very engaged in all those obstacles. But after a while, we begin to understand that something always happens and it always has to be dealt with. And that the progress we're making is really not even just finishing all these issues. It's developing the capacity within ourselves to not quit and to just persevere, whatever it might be in front of us. Swami Kriyananda, when he started developing Ananda in the late 60s, he had been a very athletic person. He was a very fast runner, and he grew up in Europe, went to school in Switzerland, and he really liked to ski. I mean, none of us ever saw that side of him for the reasons I'm going to explain. But he was a good tennis player. He really liked to ski. He was a fast runner. He wasn't a sedentary person, particularly. Sports weren't his primary interest, but he was active. But almost as soon as he started developing Ananda, by the time he was 40, he began to develop arthritis in both hips. And it was, on a more subtle level, there was a great deal of tapasya that had to be done for the founding of Ananda. Every endeavor in the world, the energy has to be gathered from somewhere. Every great epic, the hero goes out and he does penance and he wins a boon from the gods, and then that gives him the power to do what he's doing. And in some way, success requires concentration. There's an apocryphal story about someone saying to some great violinist, well known, I don't know who it was, and some adoring fan said, "Oh, I'd give my life to be able to play the violin the way you do." And the violinist says, "I have given my life. This is what I do. You do many things, I do one thing. You have many options, I have one option." And that's what makes a person great. And so Swamiji set forward to start Ananda, and he was just going to do it. He was going to, just like Helen was saying with our affirmation, excuse me. He set his mind to it, and he was going to make it happen. A highly advanced yogi, you can also use your physical body as a vehicle to overcome obstacles. So he started developing this arthritis, really, excuse me, as a symbol of having to carry this work himself. And so for over the course of 20 years, he developed ever-increasing, very, very bad pain in his hips. And it wasn't until after Ananda's 20th anniversary that he had hip replacement surgery, which had been an option for a long time. And one asked him the obvious question, "Swamiji, why didn't you do this sooner?" Well, the actual true answer was intuitively, he felt that it would be useful to keep using his body in that way. He said when the 20th anniversary of Ananda came, he realized he didn't have to carry it himself anymore. It could stand on its own 2 feet. And at that point then it occurred to him that he could have this surgery. That was one explanation. The other was even more interesting. He said there were so many obstacles to overcome in starting Ananda. Enormous personnel difficulty, persecution by his own guru bhais, foreclosure, legal problems, betrayals. I mean, it just went on and on. Just well-meaning stupidity, which just that was our contribution, just constant well-meaning stupidity, just one after another that he had to graciously relate to. But he said the pain in my body was just one more. It didn't stand out as being anything in particular. There were all these forces trying to interrupt me, and I had simply to persevere through them. Now, the whole process of the soul's long journey, which we talk about in the Festival of Light every week, the soul's long journey. We go through these different stages where we're sent out by God on this great mission to be fruitful and to gain and then to share as God has shared with us. And then what happens to us? We begin to kind of enjoy the experience. We begin to enjoy the fact that I'm powerful. I can make things happen. I can indulge my pleasures. I can have power over you. And then our appetites often get a little perverse. And we become too inclined in one direction, or we get pleasure in the wrong ways, or we desire to have the fruits of our labor, but we don't really like the labor. So we try to find shortcuts and all these different ways. And so what happens to us then is we get into the stage which is called the revolt. And the revolt is, I really don't particularly believe that there's any reality other than what I declare. And so what if the sages say this? So what if the churches say this? So what if my mother and father try to teach me this? Or ages of tradition. I'm not really interested in that. I'm enjoying myself. I'm just going to enjoy myself. We become just like little children who just say, it's going to be okay because I want it to be okay. I don't want to go to school, Mommy. I'm just going to stay here and live with you forever. Well, I don't think that's really going to work out for you, honey. Yes, it is. Have you ever heard children say that? Yes, it is. No, it's going to be fine. I didn't do it. Davey's son came to her one day, little boy, and said, just walked up to her out of nowhere particularly. I didn't do nothing, Mommy. Davey said, honey, where did you do nothing? He said, in the closet. Where she discovered he had opened and emptied all their vitamins just into a big pile on the floor, But that's like, I didn't do nothing. You just declare it and it's not true. That's the revolt. I mean, we declare it to make it true, but it isn't true. That's the stage of the revolt. I don't have to be nice. I don't have to work hard. I can get the fruits of my labor without the labor. I can just complain. I can be mean to everyone and I'll still get what I want in the end. I can squander my inheritance as the prodigal son did. I can do all those things because I want it to be true. Just like that. And we're all living through that to one extent or another because we constantly resist, don't we? We play the part of Eeyore in the Winnie the Pooh stories. Eeyore is just always kind of like, well, maybe it'll work out, but I don't think so, like this. We're always just putting that little negative, thing into everything. And so that's the revolt. And after a while, if we lived an examined life, and we go back to this, the bus driver and the journalist had been forced to live an examined life. The plans that he had for his life were completely taken away from him. And he couldn't rebel against it because his body was not going to cooperate. He had to find a completely new way. He had to find meaning in a new reality. The bus driver wasn't ready to do it. There were certain karmic things that man could easily have learned. He could have made his life into a much different life if he'd bothered to think about it. But instead, it was someone else's fault, and this was really what happened. He just he just revolted against truth itself. And that's the prize for that is you get to keep going like that. You just keep going until it doesn't work for you anymore. And then you come into what we say in the Festival of Light is the quest. Well, you don't really quite know what the answer is, but you're not so sure about what you used to think was true. Just like that atheistic man he had to die and return before he noticed, but he was so certain of what he said was right. He rejected everybody, revolted against all traditional wisdom, and I'm the one who knows. But then he went somewhere else and came back, and he suddenly realized he wasn't as certain as he thought it was. So you go on a quest. And nobody comes into this room unless you're onto a quest. We're at various stages of understanding of that. And we're still hoping that the revolt will work. I mean, I know all of us are hoping in some level. I'll speak for myself. I won't speak for you. But just, I'm always just hoping a little that the revolt will work. It was interesting. I was thinking about this the other day because you just, nothing happens unless you do it. It's not effortless on this planet. And I remember that Swami used to kvetch about that from time to time. I mean, he never really complained, but he would sigh. And he would sigh, oh well, back to work. Oh well, just one more problem. And from time to time he would flee. On more than one occasion over the years I knew him, usually Hawaii was the place where he would flee to. He would just go to Hawaii on an open-ended stay. With just this, I think he would be going to see if there really was an alternative. But of course there wasn't. And it was just a matter of gathering your forces. Master Yogananda ran away to Mexico at one point. I think after he'd been sued by one of his disciples, and the court had actually, given that man a large award and took a huge amount of Yogananda's money, and after all these years of effort, he was back to near bankruptcy. He just went to Mexico. I saw it listed somewhere as that Master took a vacation in Mexico, but he didn't take a vacation in Mexico. He left without any guarantee that he was coming back. And he sat in Mexico for a period of time until he and Divine Mother came to some agreement. And then he came back. And Swami went to Hawaii and sat for a while until he and Divine Mother came to some agreement. After one of those tests, when Swami was being severely persecuted by really unpleasant people, and Swamiji said to Divine Mother, said to Babaji, he was praying to Babaji, Babaji, why are you letting such evil people have so much power over me? Because we were caught in litigation, at which point it gets really weird. And so it was really weird. And Babaji answered him. He said, they are all my children. And you see, that's what we're dealing with. The bus driver who hits the guy and ruins his life and doesn't even remember, or changes his life and doesn't even remember. The evil man who spent a long time trying to destroy Swami and Swami's work, and all of us in the process. He spent years doing it. If he had a chance, he'd probably still be doing it. We just managed to neutralize his force. Babaji says, they're all my children. Everybody is just going through this process. And this process is to have exactly the right experiences that match the gaps in our understanding, and to be pushed to the point where the effort to change seems less terrible than staying as we are. And that's the balance point. We have this deep preference for what I call the known misery. Whatever it is, at least it's familiar. But that effort to learn something new, to go on a quest, to hear it, to see it, and to actually embrace it, it's this constant dynamic between which is worse. Master said he used to argue with Divine Mother, why do you always have to teach your children through suffering? And I always feel comforted by the fact that Master would argue with Divine Mother, because it really is unfortunate. But when we get into that stage of the revolt, where we want to declare reality and have it our way regardless, and move into that quest, there always has to be an incentive. And that incentive, usually, happiness diminishes, suffering increases, and then I'm really willing to examine my life. So this journalist also had this very strange question. Who was better off? The trajectory of his life had been completely interrupted. But as a result, he had lived a highly examined life. And he sees this man who seemed to have, quote, gotten away with it. But who was really better off? You see? And this is the cycle that we're all working from. We're perfect God's children. We rebel against our higher nature. We suffer. We begin to try to understand. And then eventually we become free. And what keeps us going is Asha. Not me, of course, but hope. There's a Sanskrit song in one of the that Swami would sing often, and one of the lines was, hope will not be realized. And speaking of spiritual realization, Swami said, I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you. He said that hope will not be realized. But of course, what that song was saying was false hope will not be realized. Because where that song goes is in the disappointment of the revolt, in the failure of the revolt, comes the power of the quest. And at the end of the quest comes redemption. And redemption is to be redeemed from delusion. That's what it means. That delusion no longer has the power to fool us. Because our lives are so examined, our awareness has become so subtle and so profound that we just see right through it. Oh, it's not going to fool me anymore. I can see that's just a little smoke over the light. Give me the light. The light is what I crave. God bless you.